In Romans 5, verse 20, speaking of grace and its effect on sin, Paul makes an interesting statement. We're probably all familiar with it. He said, where sin abounded, in other words, it overflowed, it was just overwhelming, grace also abounded. I think we could maybe add a word and change that just a little bit. In addition to when sin abounds, grace abounds also. We could also say at the very beginning of sin, grace immediately abounded. Now, what I mean there is when the first sin occurred in the Garden of Eden by Adam and Eve, grace immediately was operating toward them to keep them salvageable, keep them able for God to reach. And there are three ways in which God's grace not only worked with Adam and Eve, but still works to this day. There's at least three things. I'm sure there are more than that. But the three things that grace does to keep sin from being so overwhelming that we're not salvageable. One, God restrains our hearts. Now, by that I mean Adam and Eve immediately recognized shame. Their consciences bothered them. They recognized they were naked and therefore ashamed and disqualified in God's presence. Without grace, they wouldn't have had that attitude. Their attitude would have just followed through on their rebellious decision, and they would have simply been brazen, stiff-necked, hard, foreheaded, and no care whatsoever, defiant. They weren't. They were in a mess, and they knew it, and they ran and tried to hide from God's presence. All of that, though it seems very painful, is saving. Because if we retain a sense of, I'm wrong, my conscience smites me, there's hope for us. It's only when we reach a place through perpetual sinning that we no longer feel that we're placing ourselves in dire jeopardy of never being reached by God's grace. So grace restrains our hearts. It keeps us better than we would be were it not for grace. The second thing, grace restores our hearing. In the Garden of Eden, they heard a voice. And Adam and Eve, not only did they hear that voice, but they were also immediately able to identify it. That's God. They knew that isn't somebody else, it's God. That is a major benefit of grace, that even when we are far from God, there is a deep sense of recognition of that still small voice that arrests us, jerks us around to sanity, and stops us in our tracks and rebukes us. And we may call it a lot of things, but we recognize it's something beyond the natural. And God restores our hearing, keeps us able to hear and recognize His voice. That would be another reason why we would never be reachable if we're not for that. The third thing that is led to by the first two, and that is grace reveals our helper. It points us to hope. And when God's voice rang out through the garden, and they recognized who it was, and He found them, and they acknowledged what they had done, He revealed Himself as the only one that can help them. It just says that He clothed them. They had tried to cook up their own covering, and Humans in sin always try to manufacture a cover. And in this case, it was a real temporary coverage. It was fig leaves sewed together. Well, that's not going to last very long. God said, a covering that you've made isn't going to last. The only covering that can help you is one I alone can provide. So it said he gave them skins to cover themselves, to clothe themselves. Well, that obviously means some animals died. That begins the symbol of sacrifice, the shedding of blood, for a covering. That's what the word atonement means. He provided them a covering of animal skins, but in the same sentence and in the same act, he said to them, I am going to send the offspring of the woman, who's Christ, and he will defeat Satan. It says that he will crush Satan's head, while Satan will bruise his heel. That's the sufferings of Christ in his incarnation. But they were nothing compared to the devastating crushing of his head that Jesus delivered to him. So, three things that grace, not only immediately upon the first sin that invaded creation, but yet to this day does. Restrains our hearts and keeps us from being as wicked as we would fall to. Second, it restores our hearing. We can hear God's voice and know whose it is. And third, if we'll give that any consideration, it will lead us to, and it will reveal our capital H helper. We thank God for his eternal grace.